Assassins waited outside the classroom. The Deathworld girl turned the hallway into a graveyard. I noticed her because she sat with her back to the wall. That was the first thing. Every seat in the orientation hall was the same, padded, adjustable, built for 17 different body types, and she chose the one with solid stone behind her and a clear line to the door. She did not look nervous. She did not look like she was thinking about it at all. She just sat down, put her bag between her feet, and looked around the room the way someone looks around a room they intend to survive. My name is Vethal. I am silicoid from the third moon of Parith. My people are slow, careful, and made of something close to quartz. We do not have predators on Parith. We have never had predators. Our home world is so quiet and so safe that most other species find it unbearably boring. I find it lovely, but I understand the criticism. I had been at the Galactic Unified Academy for 6 weeks when the human arrived. I was already familiar with the rumors. Every student was. Humans were something of a running joke in the wider galactic community, a species that had evolved on a world of such extreme and constant danger that by the time they developed spaceflight, they were practically built for war. And yet they were small, soft-skinned. No claws, no armor plating, no venom, no spores, no secondary nervous system. They looked fragile. That was what made them funny, supposedly. They looked like they should not be alive, and yet here they were, very much alive, requesting admission to academic institutions and bringing their strange heated beverages everywhere they went. I had not met a human before. I was curious in the way a person is curious about something they have read about but never truly believed in. Her name was Mara Calloway. She was 23 years old, medium height. With brown hair she kept tied back in a way of moving that was quiet and precise without being stiff. She introduced herself to the orientation group with a small, easy smile. She shook hands with 3 different species, including a gret, whose outer skin secretes mild paralytic compounds on contact. She shook the gret's hand and said it was nice to meet him. She did not go numb. She wiped her palm on her jacket afterward, and that was the end of it. I introduced myself during the group session. She looked at me with what I would later understand was genuine interest. Not the polite interest of someone waiting for you to stop talking, but the kind that means a person is actually listening. She asked about Parith. She asked what the weather was like. She asked what silicoids ate. I told her we absorbed mineral compounds through our outer layer, mostly silica and trace metals. She said that was fascinating. I believe she meant it. We ended up in the same study group by the end of the first week. There were 5 of us. Mara, myself. A Thelian named Os who communicated through color shifts in her crest feathers, a Voth young called Drekel who was technically an adolescent by his species standards but already twice my height, and a Peric student named Seal who was so cautious about everything that even I found it exhausting. Mara fit into the group the way water fits into a container. She adapted to each of us without losing herself. She learned 3 words in Thelian color language within the first session, just to make us laugh. She remembered every detail anyone mentioned in passing Drekel's home province, Seal's anxiety about the xenomathematics midterm, the name I had given to the small crystalline growth on my left forearm that I had never told anyone about before. She just noticed it one day and asked, and I told her, and she remembered. She was, in every outward sense, a completely unremarkable student. And then I started noticing the other things. The hand wound was first. During our second week, she caught the edge of a lab workstation wrong and opened a cut along her palm. It was not deep, but it bled immediately in the distinctive way human blood does, bright, liquid, fast. She wrapped it in a cloth and kept working. I checked on it 4 days later, expecting the kind of slow tissue repair I was used to seeing in softer species. The cut was almost gone. Not healed exactly, but sealed, the skin already knitting back together in a way that should have taken weeks. She noticed me looking and said, "Oh, humans heal pretty fast." She said it the way someone mentions that they prefer one type of food over another, casually, as if this were not remarkable. The eating was something else. Mara ate everything. In the academy cafeteria, food was prepared for each species' dietary needs and clearly labeled. Mara would collect her tray and then spend several minutes looking at what everyone else had ordered. She tried everything she was permitted to try. She tried some things she probably was not supposed to try. One evening she ate something from the Gret station that I knew contained compounds toxic to 4 different sapient species. She made a face and said it tasted like burning rubber, but she finished it. When I asked her if she was all right, she looked at me with mild confusion and said she was fine. Why? I looked up Earth that night. I read about it for 3 hours. I could not stop. Earth is a Class 7 biosphere. That designation means it contains predators in every ecological layer, toxins in the soil and the water, atmospheric conditions that range from lethal cold to lethal heat, and a geological record of mass extinction, events so frequent that the dominant species had to develop multiple redundant survival mechanisms just to persist across generations. Humans were not at the top of Earth's food chain because they were the biggest or the fastest or the most dangerous. They were at the top because their bodies learned to endure almost everything, and their minds learned to adapt to the rest. I sat with that information for a long time. Then I looked across the dormitory common room at Mara, who was sitting cross-legged on the floor, arguing cheerfully with Os about the best way to structure a xenohistory essay, and I thought, she is from there, that planet. She grew up there, and she walks around this academy looking like the least threatening person in any room she enters. The thought was interesting in a way I did not yet have words for. Near the end of the 3rd week, I overheard a conversation I was not meant to hear. Silicoids have a narrow hearing range by galactic standards, but certain frequencies carry through stone differently than through air, and the academy's floors were partly mineral composite. 2 security staff were speaking in a corridor 2 rooms away. I caught only pieces, a name I did not recognize, the word tribunal, and then a phrase that lodged in my mind like a stone in soft soil. The consortium wants the human quieted before the hearing. I did not know what the consortium was. I did not know what hearing they meant. I told myself it was nothing, a misheard fragment, an unrelated conversation, maybe something to do with student disciplinary procedures. I told myself this with some conviction. But that night I watched Mara come back to the dormitory from the library, and I noticed again how she moved through the corridor, checking each side entrance without looking like she was checking, placing her feet quietly without looking like she was trying. And I thought about the wall she always put her back to. I did not ask her about any of it. I did not know how to ask, and I think, on some level, I was not sure I wanted to know the answer. 3 days later, over breakfast, she taught me how to say hello in a human language called Spanish. She laughed at my pronunciation. I laughed too. The morning was warm and the cafeteria smelled like something Mara called cinnamon, which she informed me was made from tree bark and was one of humanity's greatest achievements. I believed her completely. I should explain something about the Gret. They are tall, nearly 2 meters on average, with a secondary skeletal structure beneath their outer skin that makes them essentially impact-resistant. Their outer skin itself releases paralytic compounds when threatened, which is to say almost constantly, because the Gret threat response is extraordinarily sensitive. A Gret can render most species unable to move for between 4 and 40 minutes depending on species biology, body mass, and how much contact occurred. Reth was the Gret student who tried to intimidate Mara in the 3rd week of the 2nd term. I say intimidate. I am not certain that is the right word. He blocked her path in the corridor outside the xenobiology lab, stood at full height, and pressed his outer arm against her shoulder. It was the kind of contact that would have dropped most students to the floor in seconds. Mara sneezed. She stepped back, pressed her wrist under her nose, and said, "Sorry, the ventilation system in this building makes my allergies terrible." She stepped around Reth and continued down the hall. He stood there for a moment looking at the space where she had been. Then he looked at his own arm. Then he walked away very quickly in the other direction. I had watched the whole thing from the end of the corridor. I fell into step beside Mara and did not say anything for a moment. She glanced at me. What, she said. Nothing, I said. She gave me a look that meant she knew it was not nothing. But she did not push, and I did not explain, and we went to class. It was in xenobiology, that same week, that we studied Earth in the curriculum. I had already done my private reading, but this was the formal academic treatment, complete with projected imagery and Professor Donnick's careful, slightly nervous lecture voice. He was a parrot like Seal, and parrots have evolved in enclosed underground systems with very little natural danger. Professor Donnick went through the Earth slides with the expression of someone reading a list of things that had personally wronged him. I watched Mara during the lecture. She sat 2 seats to my left, chin resting on her hand, watching the images with a calm and distant expression. When Professor Donnick showed the section on apex predators and the number of venomous species alone in Earth's biological record, Drekel made a sound that in Voth indicated pure distress. Os's crest feathers went pale, which in Thelian color language means something close to disbelief. Myra yawned. Not rudely, just a small, private yawn, the kind that comes from familiarity rather than boredom. She covered her mouth, glanced at me, and seemed to realize from my expression that she had been caught. She tilted her head slightly as if to say, "What do you want me to do about it?" After class, as we walked to the study hall, I asked her if Earth had ever frightened her. She thought about it seriously, which I had come to understand was something she always did before answering a real question. "Of course," she said, "all the time when I was little. You learn which things to worry about and which things to just deal with. After a while, most of the dealing with becomes automatic." I asked what the difference was between worrying and dealing with. She considered this. "Worrying is for things you can't affect," she said. "Dealing with is for everything else." I found this answer very difficult to process, so I said nothing, and we went to study. It was during one of these study sessions, late in the 2nd month, that Mara told us why she was at the academy. Not casually. She told us carefully, in the way someone tells a story they have decided to trust you with. She had been on a cargo transit route working as a junior logistics officer on an interspecies freight vessel. The route took them through border space near the outer colonies. They had docked at a way station, and she had gone looking for a parts supplier she needed for a repair. She had found, instead, a sealed cargo hold that was not on the manifest, containing 23 beings from a colony that had been officially listed as evacuated due to infrastructure failure. The colony had not been evacuated. It had been bought. The consortium, a trading and political coalition that operated in the space between legitimate commerce and things that did not bear examining, had purchased the land rights and arranged for the population to simply disappear into transit logistics. Mara had taken photographs. She had filed a report with Galactic Tribunal oversight before she was back on the ship. She was now the only surviving witness who had physically seen the cargo hold and the beings inside it. The word surviving sat in the air after she said it. None of us asked about it directly. She said the tribunal hearing was in 4 months. She said she was at the academy because it was the safest place the tribunal's protection office could place her while she waited. She said she was not particularly worried. She said the last part in the same tone she used to say everything, and I believed her, and I did not sleep well for 2 days afterward. The 3 new students arrived in the 5th week of term. I noticed them the way you notice weather, not all at once but accumulating. 1 Rek, 1 Vathai, and 1 I could not identify at first, which was unusual because I was good at species identification. The unidentified one turned out to be a Gret in modified clothing, which suppressed the visible markers of their outer skin structure. Expensive modification. Not the kind of thing a regular exchange student would have. None of them attended classes. I saw each of them twice near the xenobiology building, once near the dormitory, and once standing at the far end of the corridor outside our study hall while we were inside. They stood very still. They did not speak to anyone. I told myself it meant nothing. I told myself this, with considerably less conviction than before. I mentioned it to no one, not even Mara. I do not know why. Perhaps I thought that numbing it would make it real, and I did not want it to be real. Perhaps I was afraid that if I told Mara, she would give me that look, that calm, measuring look, and confirm something I did not want confirmed. Whatever my reason, I said nothing. But I started paying attention to which wall Mara sat against in every room we entered, and I noticed that she always knew where all the exits were. The day it happened, Mara brought me a coffee. She did this occasionally. Humans have a substance called coffee that is mildly toxic to 4 sapient species and completely inert to humans, who consume it in large quantities and treat it as something between medicine and ritual. Mara drank it every morning. She sometimes brought me a cup with the explanation that the smell alone was worth experiencing. I could not drink it, obviously, but she was right that the smell was interesting. Warm and dark and slightly sharp. She handed me the cup at the door of Professor Donnick's Advanced Diplomatic Theory class and said, "Here, you can just hold it." I held it. We went in. We sat down. Mara took the seat against the east wall, 3 rows from the front, with a sightline to both the main door and the side entrance. I had stopped noticing this in the way you stop noticing how someone walks. It was just how she sat. Professor Donnick was covering the history of the Outer Rim Accords. Mara was engaged, which meant she had opinions, which meant the professor had to defend himself at least twice. She was not unkind about it. She simply asked the kind of questions that made it clear she had read more on the subject than was required, and had formed views that she was willing to argue for. 20 minutes into the class, the corridor lights flickered. Not all of them, not for long, just a brief, irregular pulse that could have been a power fluctuation. Professor Donnick paused, glanced at the ceiling, and continued. Drekel looked up. As's feathers went a mild, questioning yellow. Mara went still. Not the stillness of someone startled. Not the frozen quality of fear. Something else. Something that I recognized much later as the opposite of fear. A quieting of everything that was not necessary. All the extra motion and expression and casual presence that we carry when we think nothing is wrong. She set the stylus she had been using to take notes down on the desk with absolute precision. Her eyes moved to the side door, then to the main door, then to the window, quickly, cleanly, taking inventory without seeming to. She leaned toward me. She said very quietly, "How many exits does this room have?" I said 2. The main door and the side door. She said, "Where does the side door go?" I said, "The corridor to the north stairwell." She was quiet for 1 second. Then she said, "Stay in here. Don't go into the corridor. Don't let anyone go into the corridor. If you hear anything, lock the main door and wait. I will come back." I said, "What is happening?" She looked at me. It was a brief look, direct and clear. The look of someone who does not have time for a long explanation and trusts you enough to skip it. She said, "I will come back." Then she picked up her bag, left her coffee with me. She put it on the desk beside my hand, stood up, and walked to the side door. She did not hurry. She did not run. She opened the door with one hand, looked briefly into the corridor, and stepped through. The door closed. The class continued for approximately 4 seconds. Then Professor Donnick stopped mid-sentence and looked at the side door. The class looked at the side door. I looked at the side door. I stood up. It took me a moment to realize I was doing it. My legs simply decided. I moved to the front of the room. Professor Donnick asked me where I was going, and I said I did not know, which was true. I stood between the class and the main door and tried to look like a person who had a reason to be standing there. No one spoke. The lighting was normal now. Everything was entirely normal. Then from the north corridor, through the wall, through the mineral composite flooring that carries certain frequencies differently than air does, I heard it. A short, sharp sound. Then another. Then a pause. Then something that was not a sound exactly but a cessation of sound, the specific quality of absolute stillness that follows something significant. Then nothing, complete total silence from the corridor. Os's crest feathers had gone white. Drekel had pressed himself back against the wall in the posture that in Voth means do not approach. Seal was under the desk, which was reasonable. Professor Donnick was standing very still at the front of the room with the expression of a person running a complex calculation. I stood at the door and waited. 40 seconds passed. The side door opened. Mara came through. She was pressing one hand to her left shoulder where her jacket was torn. She was breathing harder than normal. I could see her chest moving faster than it usually did. Her hair had come loose from where she kept it tied. She looked in every other sense entirely like herself. She walked to her desk. She picked up her bag. She looked at me. She said, "Can you hold my coffee for one more minute? I need to make a call." She took out her communication device and stepped into the corner of the room. I heard her say, in a voice that was steady and professional and completely calm, "This is Mara Calloway, protected witness reference 7keth 12. I need to speak with tribunal security oversight. We have a situation at the academy." I looked down at the cup in my hands. The coffee was still warm. What I saw when I opened the side door 2 minutes later is something I have tried to write in my official report 4 separate times and failed each time to get exactly right. Not because the facts are complicated. The facts are simple. It is the weight of the facts that is difficult. I will try again now. The north corridor of the Xenobiology building is 42 meters long and 3 meters wide, with mineral composite flooring, recessed lighting, and 4 support columns spaced evenly along the center line. It connects the main lecture wing to the north stairwell. At the time I opened the door, it was occupied by 5 individuals who were no longer standing up. I knew 2 of the species immediately. The Gret and the Vothi were identifiable by their physical structure even in the positions they were currently occupying, which were mostly horizontal. The wreck required a moment because I had not seen a wreck in person before, only in reference materials. Wreck are close to 2.5 meters tall, heavily built, covered in natural armor plating that makes them resistant to impacts that would end most other biological entities. They are used in military and security contexts across 17 systems. Stopping a wreck in any kind of confrontation is, in most tactical literature, treated as a problem requiring either significant numbers or significant equipment. The wreck was against the far wall. It was seated. This appeared to be involuntary. I stood in the doorway, and I looked at the corridor for a long time. All 5 of them were down. The Gret, and I recognized now that it was the same Gret I had seen in modified clothing, the expensive suppression that hid the paralytic markers, was lying on its side near the second support column, one arm beneath it, entirely still in the way that means not dead but not currently available either. The Vothi, which is a species I know from the xenobiology curriculum as an ambush predator from a high-gravity world, capable of exerting force in excess of what its apparent size suggests, was sitting against the wall with its knees drawn up. It was blinking. It seemed confused about where it was. The third individual, the one I had not been able to identify before and still could not place with certainty, was folded over the base of the third support column in a way that looked uncomfortable. The 2 remaining were also down, arranged at intervals along the corridor, as if they had each encountered something at different points in an attempt to go in the same direction. Mara was standing at the far end of the corridor, near the north stairwell door. She was pressing her hand to her shoulder. The jacket was torn there, a clean separation of fabric. I could not tell from where I stood how bad the injury underneath was. She had her weight balanced evenly on both feet, and she was breathing slowly now, the deliberate, controlled breathing of someone managing exertion or managing something else. In her other hand, she had her communication device. She was speaking into it in a low, even voice. I walked the length of the corridor toward her. I should explain what this walk was like. I passed the first figure, I noted it carefully. I passed the second, I noted it. I am silicoid. We process things sequentially when the information is too large to absorb all at once. I passed the third. I noted the fourth. I stopped at the wreck because the wreck was conscious. It was sitting against the wall with its armored legs extended in front of it. One of its large, plate-covered hands was resting on the floor beside it. It was looking at Mara, not at me. At Mara, at the far end of the corridor. Its expression, and I had not known that wreck had visible expressions, the plates of their faces always seemed static, was something I had to look at for a moment before I could name it. It was afraid. Not the wide, open fear of something that does not understand what happened to it. The specific, calibrated fear of something that understood exactly what happened to it, and was now performing a complete reassessment of every decision that had led to this moment. I have only seen that expression a few times in my life, and never on a species that is essentially a living fortification. I looked at it for a moment. It did not look at me. It kept looking at Mara. I continued to the end of the corridor. Mara finished her call. She put the device in her pocket. She looked at me, and the expression on her face was the one I had come to know as her default setting, open, direct, a little tired, entirely present. I did not know what to say. I had the coffee in my hands. I held it out to her. She took it. She drank from it. She looked back down the corridor, and I looked with her. 42 meters of mineral composite floor, recessed lighting, 5 species, 5 separate reasons why nothing should have gone the way it went. I said, "Are you hurt?" She said, "A little. The shoulder is not deep. I will be fine." I said, "You will be fine." She looked at me. She heard the thing in my voice that I was not saying, which was that I had read about this, about her planet, about her species, about what it meant to grow up on a world where the soil itself tried to end you, where everything that moved was either predator or prey, and humans had evolved into something that refused to be either cleanly. I had read about it, and I had thought I understood it, and then I had walked down this corridor and understood that reading about something is not the same as standing next to it. She said, "I told you I would come back." I said, "You did." She handed me the coffee again. She said, "The tribunal security team will be here in about 6 minutes. I should stay near the stairwell. Would you mind waiting with me?" I said I would not mind at all. We stood together at the end of the corridor and waited. From behind us, through the door of the lecture room we had come from, I could hear Professor Donnick's voice, very carefully and somewhat shakily resuming the lesson on the history of the Outer Rim Accords. Down the corridor, the wreck was still looking at Mara. It had not looked away once. I thought about the word survivor again, the way she had said it in our study session. Flat and factual and without drama, because on her world, surviving was not remarkable. Surviving was just the thing you did, because the world gave you no other option, and so your body and your instincts and the particular way your mind learned to quiet everything unnecessary when something necessary was happening. All of it became automatic. All of it became the way you sat down in a room and chose the seat with the wall behind you. All of it became this corridor. She finished the coffee standing next to me. She put the empty cup in her bag with the same tidiness she brought to everything. When the security team came through the stairwell door 2 minutes later, 6 officers in the gray and blue of tribunal oversight, moving fast, she straightened, stepped forward, and began her report in the level professional voice of someone who had already decided what the next thing to do was. I stood to the side and held her empty cup and thought about the first day I met her, in the orientation hall, choosing the seat with the wall behind it. She had known, I realized, not that it would happen here maybe, but that something like this was always possible. She had been ready without looking ready, prepared without performing preparation. She had carried it all quietly, like she carried everything, her healing skin, her tolerance for compounds that dropped other species where they stood, her knowledge of exits and angles and the distance between one end of a corridor and another. She had carried it like it was simply part of being what she was. 4 days after the corridor, the academy was quieter in a particular way. Not the quiet of peace. The quiet of people who have processed something and are not quite sure what shelf to put it on. Mara was gone by the second morning. Tribunal oversight moved her to a secured facility pending the hearing, which was now accelerated. I received a short message from her communication account that said, "Thank you for holding the cup. I will see you on the other side of this." She signed it with her name, and then, below it, a small drawing of what I assumed was a cup of coffee. I kept the message. I also kept the cup. It seemed like the kind of thing worth keeping. The hearing ran for 11 days. I watched what I could through the public tribunal broadcast channels, which covered selected portions of testimony. Mara appeared on the 4th day via secured holographic transmission. She sat in front of a panel of 7 adjudicators representing 5 different systems, and she gave her testimony in the same voice she used for everything, clear and direct, and without flourish. She described what she had seen in the sealed hold. She described the 23 individuals. She described the manifest discrepancy and the documentation she had gathered in the 11 minutes she had before she needed to return to her ship. The lead counsel for the consortium defense was a Parak, whose name I did not catch. Paraks are good at legal proceedings. They are precise thinkers and careful speakers, and they have a way of constructing questions that makes it very difficult to answer without either lying or incriminating yourself in something. The consortium counsel asked Mara 14 questions in a row. I counted. Each one was carefully built around the one before it, a ladder of implications. Mara answered each one separately. She did not step onto the ladder. She answered only what was asked and nothing else, and then waited for the next question with her hands folded on the table in front of her. By question 9, the counsel had stopped looking directly at Mara's holographic image. By question 12, he was looking at his notes. By question 14, he said no further questions and sat down, and his body language, and I had learned enough about Parak physical expression by then to read it, was the body language of a person who has encountered a wall that did not move. The tribunal found in favor of the prosecution on all primary counts. The consortium was ordered to release full documentation on the colony acquisition, surrender those responsible for the transport arrangement, and fund reparations for the displaced population. It was, the coverage said, one of the most complete prosecution outcomes in 3 decades of outer border tribunal proceedings. There was a small note at the end of the broadcast about the incident at the Galactic Unified Academy in the preceding weeks. It described the apprehension of 5 individuals operating under consortium direction who had made an unauthorized attempt to interfere with a protected witness. The note was 2 sentences long. It described the 5 individuals as apprehended without significant incident. I read those 2 sentences several times. Without significant incident. I thought about the North Corridor, about 42 meters of mineral composite flooring, about a wreck seated against a wall looking at a human girl with an expression I had never seen on a wreck before. Without significant incident. I finished my xenomathematics coursework that week. I did well on it. Mara had taught me the underlying logic in our study sessions, which gave me a structural understanding I would not have had otherwise, and it held even when the specific problems were different from what we had practiced. I noted this in the margin of my returned work, and then felt obscurely that I wanted to tell her, which was when I noticed how much space she had come to occupy in the ordinary texture of my days. Term continued. The 5 students who had not been students were processed by tribunal jurisdiction and removed from academy space. Professor Donick resumed his lectures on the Outer Rim Accords and did not mention what had happened in his corridor. The academy administration sent a general message about security protocols that addressed nothing specifically. Drekel went home for a week to see his family and came back with a new jacket, and what I recognized as the particular settled quality of someone who has worked something through. Oz spent several days communicating almost exclusively in subdued blues, which in Thelian color language falls somewhere between thoughtful and grateful. Seal updated his emergency planning documentation. I walked the North Corridor every day. I am not sure why. It was not on my direct route to anything. I suppose I was doing what my people do with things that are difficult to absorb, returning to them in small, regular increments until they become familiar enough to carry. The corridor was just a corridor, 42 meters, 3 meters wide, recessed lighting, support columns, mineral composite floor. It did not look like anything in particular, but I knew what had happened in it, and so I noticed the specific way the light fell across the floor near the second column, and the distance between the third column and the stairwell door, and the quality of the silence. I measured it in all the ways a silicoid measures things, which is slowly and with attention to detail, and I kept arriving at the same place, which was this: a single human being, 23 years old, with no armor plating, no natural venom, no paralytic compounds, no biological adaptations that any other species in that corridor possessed, had walked through a side door, and then the corridor was simply dealt with. Not through equipment, not through reinforcement, through what she was. Through what her world had made her, over a very long time, and through very consistent pressure. I finished my report eventually. The version I submitted was 4 pages long, accurate in every particular, and contained the sentence: 5 individuals were apprehended before they could fulfill their objective. I did not say by whom. I did not say how. The tribunal records contained all of that. My report did not need to. The new human student arrived on the first day of the following term. I was given the assignment of orientation guide because I was in my 3rd term, and the administrative office considered me organized, which I am. I was standing in the entrance atrium of the main building when he came through the primary doors, bag over one shoulder, looking around with the alert, open attention of someone arriving somewhere new. His name was Owen Hartley, 21 years old, first Galactic placement, engineering focus. He was not tall. He had fair hair and an easy, slightly distracted look, the look of someone whose mind was partly somewhere else. He was reading the room without appearing to read the room. His eyes moved across the exits, the pillars, the open space between the entry doors and the interior corridors, a complete inventory, casual and total. Then he found the wall at the far side of the atrium, where the stone was solid, and the sightline was clear to all 3 visible entrances, and he moved toward it with the naturalness of someone going to a seat that had always been theirs. He put his back to the wall and looked at me. He said, "You must be my guide. Sorry, I always do that first. Old habit." I looked at him for a moment. I thought about Mara. I thought about the North Corridor and the empty coffee cup and the message on my device with its small drawing at the bottom. I thought about the wreck that could not look away from her. I thought about what it meant to come from a world that never gave you the option of being anything other than ready. I said, "My name is Vethal. Welcome to the Galactic Unified Academy. I should probably tell you that the wider galactic community has some misconceptions about your species." He smiled. It was a very human smile, easy on the surface and something else beneath it. Something that knew more than it was currently showing. He said, "Yeah, they usually do." We stood together in the atrium, and I thought about what I would tell him. About the academy, its policies, its study groups, its cafeteria, the xenobiology course that would include an Earth module in the 2nd term. About Oss and Drekel and Seal, who were already waiting in the study hall. About Professor Donek, who was a very good teacher once you accounted for his particular nervousness about certain topics. I thought about whether I would tell him about Mara, about what she had done and what she had been, and the way she moved through every room like she was always, quietly, keeping account of something. I decided I would, eventually, when the time was right. It was not a story to rush. But there was something in the way he was standing there, back to the wall, eyes on the room, perfectly at ease in the way that is actually the opposite of being at ease, that told me he did not need the story to understand the principle. He had already learned it, the way all humans learn it, not in a classroom, not from a book, from a world that made certain things automatic. I said, "Shall we start with the dormitory wing or the academic buildings?" He said, "Academic buildings. I want to know the layout." "Of course you do," I thought. "Of course you do." I said, "Follow me." And we went in. I still have the cup. It sits on the mineral shelf above my study space, next to my academic texts and the small notation on a card that I wrote during the xenomathematics course. The underlying logic holds even when the specific problem is different. I think about that a lot, about underlying logic, about the things that remain true regardless of which corridor you are standing in, or which door just opened, or how many species are between you and the exit. Mara never came back to the academy, not in that term, but I received one more message from her, after the tribunal concluded, after the settlement was reached, after the 23 colony residents were officially located and their documentation corrected, and their lives returned to something that resembled continuity. The message said, "The coffee on my side was better than the cafeteria anyway. Take care of the others." I wrote back. I told her about Owen Hartley and his first hour at the academy and the wall he had put his back to within 30 seconds of entering the atrium. I told her I thought she would appreciate it. She replied 4 hours later with 2 words, "They always do." I read that and I thought about a planet of impossible danger and a species that had lived on it long enough to stop thinking of danger as unusual. I thought about what it produces, over generations and centuries, in the blood and the bone and the particular wiring of the mind. I thought about how you carry all of that quietly into a room and sit down and look like the least threatening person present. And then someone opens a door, and the corridor tells you what it knew all along. I think about Mara sometimes when I walk that corridor on my way to nowhere in particular. I think about the wreck's face. I think about the moment she told me to stay inside, and how she looked at me and said, "I will come back," and how she said it not as a promise but as a simple statement of what was going to happen, because she had already decided. That is the thing about humans. Not the strength, not the speed, not the remarkable biology that heals and endures and processes compounds that stop others cold. All of that is real and I am not dismissing it. But the thing underneath all of it, the thing that the wider galaxy keeps missing when it makes its polite little jokes about the small soft species from the dangerous world, the thing underneath is this. They decide. Before the door opens, before the lights flicker, before there is any visible reason to decide anything at all. They look at the room and they find the wall and they sit down and something in them, quiet as quartz, makes a decision that the rest of them will carry out without drama and without announcement. I will come back. And then they do. Owen Hartley is in his second term now. He is doing well in his engineering modules and has a particular talent for applied xenomechanics. He has also, without being asked and without commenting on it, begun sitting in the seat nearest the wall in every class he attends. Oss finds this charming. Drekel finds it quietly reassuring. Seal has updated his emergency documentation to note a new factor. I find it simply true, simply what it is. I keep the cup on the shelf and I keep Mara's messages. And every time I walk the North Corridor, I measure it in the way silicoids measure things. Slowly, carefully, returning to the same place until it is familiar enough to carry. 42 meters, 5 figures, 1 human, without significant incident. The logic as ever holds.